Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing this morning? How many of you still have to buy Halloween candy? Anybody? Yeah, some of you. You see which houses not to go to. You get the bad stuff. That's all that's left, the Rolos. That's what they hand out. Like, here's a Rolo, kid. And then that's who the kids give the Rolo to mom and dad. Hey, you can have this one, right? Hey, we are excited to be starting a new series today. Really, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be going through this series, and it really is one of the most important things, I think, for the life of our church. I think this series and what we're going to talk about is really going to kind of create a path, a vision, a direction for the next 10 years even in the life of our church, and there's a part for all of you to play in that. So I hope you will make it a priority to be here the next 3 weeks as we gather and talk about this, and really that you would open your hearts to what God would say to you, how God would speak to you as we think about the future of Church 8025. And we kind of have a theme for this over the next several weeks and even months to come. And you have this theme in your seat. There's a little, it's not a sticker, it's a cling, I was told. So if you try to stick it on something, it won't. It has to cling to something. I'm not sure the difference at this point in my life, but I'm going to look it up later. But you have one of those. But this is our theme, is Mark 11:23. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Jesus is teaching this. Jesus tells us this. We have this in our app. You can go in, you can download and make this the wallpaper on your phone. We really want this to be, over the next months and even years, to be a theme for our church. In fact, we're calling it, this theme, Moving Mountains. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. And here's the mission of our church, in case you don't know, in case you've forgotten it, is to reach people who reach people to be fully devoted followers of Jesus. This is our mission. Everything we do it with this in mind. We have events with this in mind. We budget with this in mind. We teach with this in mind. We keep this mission at the forefront of everything we do. And so that means there's things that we say no to. And sometimes they're really good things. They're great things, but we say no to them because they don't help us move this mission forward, and so we don't do them. This mission that we feel God has given us is at the forefront of everything we do. And we just believe that we're at a place in the life of our church that we see God moving. Maybe you see it in your mission groups. Maybe you see it here on a Sunday gathering. Maybe you see it through discipleship. But we see God moving in a lot of ways, and in ways that specifically help us to continue to accomplish this mission of reaching people who reach people to be fully devoted followers of Jesus. And so today we are, as a church, publicly kicking off this thing called Moving Mountains, because we believe God has positioned Church 8025 in a season of momentum and in a season of movement to accomplish something really that's bigger than each of us, that's bigger than just our church. We believe God is doing something, and that He's telling 8025 that it is time for us to move. And this is not new. This is something He has done before, because God is a God of movement. You cannot read Scripture and see an idle God. He is always up to something. He's always doing something. He's always moving His people forward to advance His kingdom. And we have the responsibility to steward our individual lives, but also to steward the church well. To steward the church to what God has called us to. The things He has blessed us with, we have to steward, meaning that we always use what God has given us for His kingdom over our own. Biblical stewardship, you can remember, contains the idea of giving every part of your life to something greater than yourself. Biblical stewardship is surrendering every part of your life to something greater than yourself. And I want to show this principle to you in a story today. We're going to be in the book of Nehemiah. It is in the Old Testament. And if you don't have a Bible, we have some on the table back there we'd love to give you as a gift. It'll also be on the screens for you this morning. But let me set the stage for you, a little bit of background here. This is a story really about the Jewish nation who had been overrun Judah had been destroyed. Jerusalem, the capital, had been taken captive by a man named Nebuchadnezzar. If you grew up in church, you're familiar with that name probably. He is the one who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace, or when I was a little kid, as we called it, Shadrach, Meshach, and a billy goat. We always wondered why they had a billy goat going around with them. I learned later in life it was 3 people, not 2 people and a goat. But anyways, that's the man, that's the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is about 70 years after he goes in and destroys Jerusalem and takes people captive. He begins to allow people to return home. He allows them to leave captivity and go back. That's kind of a way in that time that you would expand your kingdom. You would bring captured people in for a couple of generations, and so you kind of indoctrinate them into your life, and then you would send them back home, and they would be part of your kingdom. And so he allows people to go back home, and about 2% of the Israelites, the Jews, make their trip back home. And they get back home, and they begin to rebuild the temple, which was a key piece of their relationship with God in the Old Testament. And the book Nehemiah begins about 100 years after the first captives have returned. So this isn't like, hey, this country has been destroyed, and just a little while later, Nehemiah's on the scene. This is about 100 years after the captives have returned. So we're talking 150, 170 years after Jerusalem has been destroyed, and the wall around the city, every city in those days had to have a wall around it for protection, for strength, for power. If you did not have a wall, you would not last. The wall around Jerusalem is still down. And in fact, if you read in Ezra, which is a book before Nehemiah, you find out that some of those people who had went back had tried to kind of start rebuilding the wall, but the enemies around Judah came and stopped them because they remembered how powerful they used to be, and they didn't want them to return to that power, and so they kept them from rebuilding the wall. And so 100 years after people return from captivity, we pick up the story of Nehemiah. And I love the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is one of my favorite men in the Bible. I just love how he approached the mission that God gives him. Here's why I love him, is because we see a few things in his life we're going to look at today that's really a prayer for my life. I think it would be a prayer for your life, but it's also a prayer for our church. And so we're going to look at 4 attributes of his life, beginning in Nehemiah chapter 1, in verse 1 through 3. It says this: "During the month of Chislev in the 20th year, when I was in the fortress city of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah. And I questioned them about Jerusalem and the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. And they said to me, 'The remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down, and its gates have been burned.'" So that's Nehemiah talking. He's telling his story here. And then look what he says. This is so powerful. "When I heard these words, I sat down and wept." When he hears these words, he sits down and weeps. And here's why. It's because Nehemiah had a burden for the people. He had a burden for the people who were back there. He gets this burden for the people back in Jerusalem. He asks his friends, his family, "Hey, tell me about Jerusalem. What's going on there?" And he hears the reports, and it just breaks his heart. He begins to weep. He begins to cry. And you can't read this and not see that he has a clear and a compelling burden for the people of Jerusalem. It's been over 100 years since it has been destroyed. A lot of people have come and gone. A lot of people have moved back, but God chose Nehemiah to carry the burden for that city. Nehemiah had a burden for the people. And then look down in verse 4, it says this: "I mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of the heavens." Nehemiah didn't just have a burden. Nehemiah also pursued God. He gets this burden from God. He first gets this burden, and then he begins to pursue God. And he prays about it. And we don't have time today to go through his prayer. I would encourage you to go back. You can read his prayer in verse 5 through 11. But this is not some over-dinner prayer. This is not some, hey, this just popped in my mind. Let me pray about it real quick. This is Nehemiah mourning and fasting and crying out to God. He is brokenhearted because he understands what should be. And he actually prays for months. If you do the timeline as they give the months in this chapter, he prays for 4 months. He pursues God to see what to do about this burden. And then he asks God to be with him. Look in verse 11 of chapter 1. It says, give your servant, this is Nehemiah, give your servant success today and grant him compassion in the presence of this man. He's talking about the king, because I was cupbearer to the king. So Nehemiah has a burden. He begins to weep and mourn. He knows he's got to do something. He knows he's going to go to the king, and he asks God to give him favor. Now, if you don't know what a cupbearer is, anybody in here a cupbearer to the king? No, okay. It's not a real prominent position anymore. It's hard to get. But it was a really important position back then. The cupbearer to the king, one of his first jobs was to test the juice and the food that was made for the king. Because one of the easiest ways for somebody else to become king was to what? Yeah, boy, man, I'm getting on y'all's bad side, all right? Y'all knew that answer way too quick, all right? Yeah. Kill the king through poisoning him. And so the cupbearer would taste these things. And I don't know how this went, but in my mind, I'm just like picturing the food laid out. The cupbearer comes around, takes a few bites, and everybody's kind of like, okay, it's good. Go ahead, king. You can eat, you know? And so it has to be somebody he trusts. But it wasn't just somebody that he trusted to taste the food for him. Because there was such this high level of trust, it was somebody that the king would go to for advice. The king would ask him, what's going on in the nation? What's going on with my people? And he would lean into him kind of as an advisor. But even though there was that relationship, there was still, you didn't bring your mess to the king. You didn't bring your problems to the king. The king could bring his to you. He could say to you as the cupbearer, hey, I'm mad about this. I'm angry about this. I'm upset about this. But you couldn't bring your problems to the king. And this is who Nehemiah was. And he asked God to find favor in him. And then read what happens next for Nehemiah. In chapter 2, he says this, during the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. Nehemiah says, I've never been sad in his presence because he's the king. So the king says to me, why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? The king notices, the king says, this is nothing but sadness of heart. And Nehemiah says, I was overwhelmed with fear. I was overwhelmed with fear. Do you know why he was overwhelmed with fear? Because Nehemiah was at a point in his life where he was willing to sacrifice for his burden. He has a burden for Jerusalem. He has spent time with God, and now he's going before the king, and he is absolutely terrified because Nehemiah is willing to sacrifice everything for his burden. It's been 4 months since he started praying this serious prayer. And he's scared because you don't go before the king with a bad attitude. You don't go before the king when you're upset. You know, if you're a parent, when you have little kids, I don't know why we say this because I don't think it works this way, but I've said it before, right? You better change your what? Attitude. Yeah. You can tell the strict parents, you better change your attitude, right? As though it's like, okay, well, I'll be happy now, right? Or you better put a what on your face? Smile. Some good parents in here. We're on the same page, right? Well, that's kind of how you had to be before you went to the king. You just had to flip the switch. You had to change your attitude. You had to put a smile on your face. And Nehemiah knows that's what he's supposed to do. And he doesn't do it. For the first time ever, as he has served the king, he goes into his presence and he is upset. And the king notices. And he calls Nehemiah out. And Nehemiah is afraid. He is overwhelmed. And here's what we need to understand is that Nehemiah's friends, the ones who came to him and began to tell him about Jerusalem, they cared about Jerusalem, but Nehemiah was burdened for Jerusalem. The other people cared about it. They saw the same thing Nehemiah did. They had the same opportunity. They certainly cared. They told Nehemiah. But here's the difference. People who care talk about things. People who are burdened do something about them. Right? There's a lot of things that you care about. And there's a lot of things I care about. And we say, oh, I wish it wasn't that way. Oh, I wish it was this way. Oh, I wish things were better. But it's the things that burden us that move our words to action. And Nehemiah was burdened, and his burden led him to pursue God. And the more he pursued God, the more his heart aligned with God, and he was willing to sacrifice. At the very least, walking in front of the king with a sad countenance could have cost him his job. At the most, it could have cost him his life. And he knew this. And he chose to go before the king. And after all the prayer, he's still nervous. He knows he's willing to sacrifice. He knows what he's prayed, and he goes for it. Look in verse 3. I was overwhelmed with fear and replied to the king, "May the king live forever." Now, side note, if you're ever in front of a king about to tell him something you think you don't want to hear, that's a good way to start it, okay? Hey, king, I hope you live forever, man. Okay, that's what he says here. "Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And then the king asked me, "What is your request?" And I love this part right here. This is us, right? We've prayed about something. We've prayed. He's prayed for 4 months. And what does it say to do? I prayed to the God of heavens. This was a quick, hey, God, I know I've prayed a lot, but still, I still need you to be here right now, okay? It was that last minute, hey, I'm just throwing one more prayer in here. We've all been there. So I prayed to God of the heavens and answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it." So he's in front of the king with a sad countenance. The king notices it. Nehemiah is willing to sacrifice everything because of the burden God has laid on his heart. He knew what God was calling him to do, so he throws it all out there and he asks the king, and look what happens to Nehemiah. God blesses him. God blesses him for being obedient. He's been praying for 4 months. He's willing to sacrifice everything. Look down in verse 8 of chapter 2, the answer. "The king granted my request, for the gracious hand of my God was on me." Man, I love this story. Nehemiah did not know how this was going to play out. All he knew was that God had given him a burden. And he had pursued God in this burden, said, "God, what should I do?" And God told him. And he obeyed, and God heard his prayer. He answered it. God blesses movement that is led by him. When you read in the previous verses, when you read the rest of the story, you see that the king not only says yes to build the wall, but he says, "Hey, I'm going to send basically a military escort with you so that you're safe. I'm going to send a letter to the governors in the regions around the area so that they give you passage to go through it. Hey, I'm even going to pay for all the lumber that you need to rebuild this wall." Nehemiah consistently prayed to be a part of what God was doing. And when God heard his prayers and answered his prayer, he opened doors that Nehemiah had never imagined. Like, Nehemiah just wanted to resign from his position. That's it. Just picture how this went down with Nehemiah. I'm sure that in this 4 months as he's praying, he talks to his friends and he says, "Hey, listen, I'm going in today. I need you guys praying for me. I'm going before the king today, and I'm going to ask to resign." Right? And his friends, because they love him, are like, "Nehemiah, that's not going to work. You don't get to resign from the king. He's the king. You don't get to resign from him." Nehemiah's like, yep, that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to ask him to go to Jerusalem and build a wall around the city that used to be against him. And his friends are like, "Nehemiah, what? I doubt that's going to happen, okay? Like, he wanted that nation destroyed. He has ruled over us. I doubt he's going to allow that." And Nehemiah's, "Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Oh, also, I need you to pray, because I'm going to ask him to ask all of his officials to give me a military escort as I travel through the lands." Right? And his friends are like, "Nehemiah, you're dead. Like, this is not going to happen. The king is going to kill you." Nehemiah's like, "Yeah, possibly. One more thing. If you could just pray, I'm going to ask the king to pay for it all too." Right? And the friends are like, "Hey, maybe you should just call in sick today. This is not a good day for you to go to work. I don't think you've got a good plan." But Nehemiah does all of this because he knew God was in the mountain moving business. He knew that God was up to something. When God is moving mountains, here's the truth. We all have a choice. When God is up to something, we can either get involved or we can miss out. We can get involved with what God is doing, or we can miss out. Because here's what I know is true. God would have used somebody else to rebuild that wall. We just wouldn't be reading about Nehemiah today. We'd be reading about somebody else. When God is doing something, we can choose to be involved or miss out. And we believe as a church, this is where we find ourselves today, where Nehemiah was, in really what is a Mark 11 moment, which I want to read to you again. Jesus says, truly I tell you, Nehemiah, truly I tell you, Church 8025, if anyone says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. And in this theme for moving mountains, there's 3 keys that we have to keep in front of us over the weeks and months and years to come that we see in this teaching from Jesus. The first is this, is that we need faith that stretches us. Right? As people, as individuals, and as a church, we need faith that stretches us. Jesus says, if you believe and don't doubt. Now, this is not a prosperity gospel. This is not name it and claim it, okay? We don't teach that. We don't believe that here. But right before this, verse 23, it says, Jesus says, have faith in God. He tells them, hey, have faith in God. One idea of this faith, one part of this faith is that what Jesus says, that you believe and you don't doubt. That doesn't mean that the strength of our faith is what changes things. It means the strength of the person that we're taking whatever faith we have to can. This is a prayer where Jesus is saying, hey, if you align your heart with God's, this is the prayer that Nehemiah spent months doing, aligning his heart with God's, aligning himself with God. Jesus says that prayer you can pray with complete faith in God. And so in 8025, we have tried to the best that we can align our heart with God to pursue his kingdom and not our own, which seems like an easy thing to do as a church, but the truth is it can be easy for churches to get sidetracked onto our own kingdom, but we don't want to do that. We want to be focused on God's kingdom, and when he begins to call, when he begins to speak to us, we want to express the faith that's required. We want to have faith in him, and we've expressed that faith in God through movement. We have been a church who has moved when God has told us to move. 8025 in 2 years. If you don't know, we've been around for about 2 years. Some of you have been there from the beginning. Some of you have joined us along the way. But over those 2 years, this small church has given $70,000 to ministries to help with adoption, to help less fortunate, to help plant churches in Africa, to help thousands of students every year hear about Jesus. This small church, $70,000 in 2 years. That's God moving through us. In fact, we, if you don't know, started in a house, in a living room, and it was a small setup, way less set up than today. We just had to put some chairs out and some muffins, and that was it. You guys have gotten greedy since then, all right? I'm just kidding. But we outgrew that. God moved, and so we took a step of faith because the house was free, the theater was not. We moved into a movie theater. And we were in that theater for a few weeks, and COVID, like so many things, closed it down. And we said, God, what are we going to do? And God presented this to us, and so we moved again in another step of faith. We have expressed our obedience to God through moving when he has told us to move. Because here's what we believe, is that God honors movement. God honors movement. When he tells his people to move, he honors when they obey. When God calls his people to move, guess what he expects us to do? Move. He expects us to move. The key to moving mountain is that we have a faith that stretches us. But another one is this, is that we need to dream dreams that are big. Like we need to have big dreams as we think about God's kingdom. He says, truly I tell you, if anyone says to what? To this mountain. Like, this is a big visual that Jesus is giving to people. We see in this passage that God expects to do big things for his people. We often say, I've read this quote, I forget right now who says it, but we often think little of prayer because our prayers are so little. We often don't expect much from God because we've never gone to God and asked him for much. And Jesus says, mountains can be thrown into the sea. Any of you had that friend growing up that just came up with crazy ideas? Anybody? Just like the crazy friend, your mom or dad? I'm the only one who had that friend. That means all of you were that people. Because in every friend group, there's the friend that your mom or dad is like, hey, I hope you have a great time. Don't do what John says, okay? Just don't do it. You're like, he didn't say it. I just know. Just don't do it. You all have that friend that's crazy that's like, hey, what do you want for Christmas this year? You know, and they're like, it's a 10-year-old. I'm really hoping for a trip to Australia. And you're like, I don't think that's happening. You know, I don't think your parents are doing that, or they grow up, you know, hey, how's things going in your life? Oh, pretty good. I'm going to quit my job and start a restaurant. Yeah, tomorrow, actually. You know, and you're like, do you have any money? No. Do you got a place to do this? No, not yet. I've only seen you make chicken nuggets. Do you know how to cook? You know, no. I'm going to figure it out along the way, right? Like, it's just these big, audacious, bold dreams. We all have a friend like that, the friend that's always the dreamer. And maybe, well, let's just give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe someone in the crowd is that type of person that Jesus is talking to when he says this in Mark. Maybe there's someone in the crowd who's the big dreamer. But even if there were people in the crowd, I'm positive that no one was walking around thinking, much less talking about, wishing that mountains could be thrown into the sea. The biggest dreamer in that group, I doubt, had ever discussed that topic, right? Like, it's not like Matthew and Peter are often off talking, you know. Hey, how's Peter doing today? Oh, you know, Peter, he's complaining about that mountain again. He's always talking about throwing it into the sea. You know, like, this is not a topic of conversation. Nobody is walking around thinking that. It's just something so out of the ordinary, something so big, something that doesn't seem possible. It's Nehemiah saying, hey, I'm going to resign my position and get the king to fund everything and guard me while I rebuild a wall. And Jesus is using this imagery not so that we can toss mountains into seas, okay? No, that's not his purpose here. But he knows that he is God. And the things that we could think are never possible, he can do. The things that overwhelm us are easy for God. And we have experienced this. We've experienced this in the last few years as we've moved from place to place. We've experienced it. We began raising money for land. Many of you know about this. On 136. And as we got in this process, it was going to be over $2 million to get this land and be ready to build anything on it. And we prayed and we felt God moving, and we began moving in that direction. And as this became a little bigger than we thought, man, we can handle, but we knew we were trusting God, I get a call one day, and somebody said, hey, do you guys want 3 acres and a building on it for free? And I didn't ask any questions. I just said, yes, we do, absolutely, right? And here's what's happening. So I'm praying, we're praying, our team's praying, God, here's how things go. You find a piece of property, you make an offer on it, you go back and forth for a while, you stress about paying because property is so expensive here, but we're going to do it, so we're going to take that step of faith. And God said, hey, thanks for taking that step of faith. I'm going to honor your movement, but it's not going to look the way you thought. I'm just going to give you 3 acres and a building. Like, that doesn't happen, okay? Like, we can't take for granted that God is doing something in 8025. To just give us 3 acres and a building for free. God does things that we can't imagine. You know what? I never sat down and prayed. You know what? I never let our staff in. I never led you guys in. And God, forgive me for not doing this. But I never said, hey, God, would you just give us what we need instead of us having to pay for it? I never prayed that. Because in my mind, that's not how it happens. We have to have faith in God. We have to dream dreams that are big But then there's the last key to moving mountains. We have to remember only God can do it. Only God can do it. Look at this in Mark 11:23. It says, if you ask all of these things, it will happen, and it will be done what? For him. The person who asks, it will be done for him. It does not say it will be done by him. Right? It says it will be done for him. When God calls us to move, he is calling us not because of our abilities, but because of his abilities. When God calls us to move, it's not because of our strength, it is because of his strength. We can want mountains to move all day long, and we can plan, and we can strategize, and we should. But unless God shows up, church, we're just wasting our time. Unless God shows up, we are just wasting our time. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 16:18. He says, also I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock, what? Who's going to build the church? Yeah, I will build my church. Jesus didn't say you build the church. Jesus didn't say you figure it out. Jesus said, hey, you go make disciples. That's what he told us to do. That's your job. That's my job. That's our church's job, is to make disciples, and he will build his church. He is the one. It is not us. But he uses his people to accomplish the advancement of his kingdom. And so it's like this. We are putting up the sails of faith. Right? You've seen sailboats. I know it's not a big activity here in Colorado, but you've seen these boats with these giant sails. And they can have the most amazing sails in the world. But if they don't have what? Are they going to move? If they don't have what? Wind. Yeah. They can come out on the deck of the boat and say, hey, look at this beautiful sail. I just bought it the other day. It was $100,000. It's bigger than all the other sails around here. It's a better color. It's the newest thing. It's fancy. And their boat will set in the same place forever if they don't have wind. And so we have put up the sails of faith. But we have invited the wind of God into our church for him to move, so that if he chooses, we move with him. And it looks like for us what it looked like for Nehemiah. This is done because we have a burden in our heart for the community. Like, I truly believe that Jesus is the hope of the world. And that Jesus uses his church to tell others about Jesus. And that burden has caused us to pursue God with everything we have. And in our pursuit of God, we have come to a place where we are willing to sacrifice our plans for his plans. And it's in that time of sacrifice that God shows up and blesses. See, biblical stewardship looks like taking steps of faith towards God-sized dreams, but knowing that God has to show up. And for Nehemiah and for those in Mark and for you and me, ultimately, here's what God calls us to. God calls us to surrender every part of our lives to him for the advancement of his kingdom. Not your kingdom, not my kingdom, not 80-25. It is for the advancement of God's kingdom. And so before I move into what that looks like for us right now, I just want to share with those of you who are visiting who maybe don't call 80-25 home. I want you to know we thank you for being here. We are excited that you are here. We believe that God's word has the power to change life, and we teach God's word. But I also want you to know, as I begin to talk to those who call this church home, that for those of you who are visiting or checking 80-25 out, the only thing we want from you, or the only thing we want for you, is to know that Jesus loves you and he will radically change your life if you let him. That's all we want for you. And for those who have been a part of 80-25 and who call it home, let me talk to you for a minute. Over the last year, our staff team and some of our key leaders, our board, and then even as a congregation, we have talked about this. We've been praying about what's next for 80-25. We've constantly been asking, where is God leading us? And as we begin to get ready to move to a new facility over off of Cottonwood that is being renovated right now. It's being painted. Guys, November 12th, show up. This is a shame that's a whatever plug, but I don't want to move all the rocks by myself is what I'm trying to say. So be there to landscape. Man, we're so thankful for that. God showed up in such a way that we couldn't imagine. Let me blow your minds a little bit. This isn't in my notes. This is free. Our goal is to be in there. Not that I charge you for the rest of it, but whatever. Our goal, we're shooting for to be in there by December. 2 weeks ago, I contacted the Hilton, who I'm very thankful for, and they have been gracious to us and have allowed us to rent this place. But I contacted them. Construction stuff hits deadlines or misses deadlines. You overgo. And so I contacted them to ask about go ahead and signing a contract for the first few months of next year. And they said, hey, we're not going to rent to you guys anymore at the end of this year. And I said, well, suckers, you don't know what God's done for us. No, I didn't say that. Well, I wanted to, man. I wanted to. Yeah, they said, you've been great tenants and stuff, but, after COVID and more businesses coming back, there's lots of events we can't do that are weekend-long events because you guys are, and I totally understand that. I'm switching my loyalty to Marriott, but it's okay. I'm just kidding. Kind of. But here's what I'm saying, is God is doing something. Like, what if I had gotten that news without what he's already done? We don't have a place to go, right? We're back to the children of Israel, just wandering the desert, house, movie theater, back in the homes, it's like, hey, anybody got a big garage? No, God's like, hey, Michael, stop. Just be willing to move when I tell you to move. And I'm so thankful that you guys have been that. We go to church in a hotel. It's weird. I get that. But you've been faithful. And God is honoring your faithfulness. I don't even know where I'm at in my notes now. I got to find my place here. But over the last year, we have moved when God has said to move. And as we begin to get ready to move into this new facility, if we have what we've had over the last several months, we will be full in that facility from day one, which is awesome, which is great. It's more people hearing about Jesus. So we are thankful for that, but we want to be ready for what God is doing next. And we believe, after we have sought God, after we have developed a burden because of our seeking God, that it's time for us to build a permanent home on the property that he has given us. And so that's where we're moving to. And a new building on this property gives us the room to grow. It gives us the ability to reach our community better, to be more intentional about making disciples. Now, if you've been here for any time, I got in trouble a few weeks ago, but if you've been here for any time, this is not about a building. I made the statement, I would rather the building burn to the ground. My wife told me after I shouldn't say stuff like that from up here. And I was like, but I meant it, honey. But she said, that's not reason enough. This is not about a building, okay? Please hear me say that. A building is just a tool that God, we believe, is moving us towards so that we can accomplish the mission of advancing his kingdom better. And so we want to move when he asks us to move. So what am I asking you to do, church? I'm asking you to move. I'm asking you to see the burden for lostness in our community. It is everywhere. It is everywhere. Start on your street. What people around you know Jesus? There are so many who need the hope of Jesus. See the burden for 80-25 to plant roots in the community, to share Jesus, not so that our name will be known. Our church is going to die one day. Every church does. I'm okay with that. The name of Jesus will never die. That is why we exist. I'm asking you to see that burden. And spend the next few weeks on your own or with your spouse praying about how God would lead you to sacrificially give above and beyond what you normally give. What is God leading you to give to this God-sized dream so that it can become a reality? And so our prayer as a church is that over the next 36 months, we raise $500,000 towards this project over the next 3 years. So that everyone who calls 8025 home, our prayer is that everyone who calls it that will play a part in continuing to establish a life-giving church in our community. Because this goal positions us to create even more momentum, even more movement to people hearing about Jesus, to hearing about their Heavenly Father. And yes, it is a God-sized dream. It's really only a dream that God can accomplish. I'm fully aware of that. That's why I'm not asking you to ask yourself, hey, how much can you afford? I'm asking you to be like Nehemiah and see the burden and go to God and be willing to sacrifice. I'm asking you to surrender every part of your life for the advancement of God's kingdom. And I want you to know I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not doing. My wife and I have already sat down. We've already spent time in prayer with this. We've already said, God, what we have is yours. What do you want of us? How can we sacrifice in our lives for your kingdom? How can we sacrifice something that we love for something that we love more? Because there should be nothing we love more than people hearing about Jesus. And we believe that God is doing something, and we want to be a part of what he's doing. We want people that Jesus was talking to in Mark 11. We want to be like that. We want to take steps of faith. We want to dream big dreams. We want to live like Nehemiah with a burden for people pursuing God, willing to sacrifice whatever God asks us to sacrifice. So here's what I want to ask you to do really over the next 2 weeks. We don't have a service next week. It's the 5th Sunday. So here's what I want to ask you to do. You have these little brochures. If you'll get these out. One's a little trifold that has some information on it about this. And it has a QR code on the back that will take you to our website that shows a video that has some more things you can download. It has a PDF you can download and read more about it. So I want you to take that home. But here's what I want you to do in the next couple of weeks. I want you to take this commitment card. And here's what I want you to ask. Ask God what part he wants you to play in giving sacrificially to advancing his kingdom. What part does he want you to play to give sacrificially to advance his kingdom? That's it. That's all I want you to do the next few weeks. We know that God is moving. We know that God will lead each of us as he sees fit. We're trusting that our church will humbly ask God what role he wants us to play and that he will speak to us. We believe that he will do this. And we know this is a significant ask of our church. I understand that. But we also fully believe that the local church is the hope of the world. We're excited to see how God uses and blesses not just our church, but you individually as you sacrificially commit to his kingdom. So what the next few weeks that we gather is going to look like is you have these cards, and starting in 2 weeks, we'll have a little thing back there for you to begin to drop commitment cards off as you have prayed about it. And then in November, on November the 13th, 12th, 13th. God, you tricked me, Brian. We're friends too. The 13th, I believe, is the last one. We're going to share as a church just what God has done. I'm not going to share your individual commitments with the church. We're going to share corporately what God has laid on our hearts and how he is beginning to move forward. And here's my prayer. This is a 3-year time frame for this commitment, but here's my prayer, is that in 12 or 18 months, we're at the place that we're beginning to break ground and build what God is leading us to build. That's my prayer for our church, a place that we can grow, that we can disciple people, and that we can impact our community. So this week and next week and even the weeks after, I'm going to ask you to ask this question. What part does God want you to sacrificially play advancing his kingdom. In fact, we're going to take a moment right now, right where you are in your seats, to begin this prayer, asking God to burden you, that you would hear from him. So if you would, where you are, just bow your heads and close your eyes and take a moment and begin having this conversation. Heavenly Father. Heavenly Father, we humbly approach you. We desire to approach you as Nehemiah did, with a burden for people to come to know you. God, break our hearts for the lostness in our community. Let's just start there. God, we come to you trusting that you have called us to begin this movement. And that when we align our hearts with yours, nothing is impossible. God, that's what we desperately want to do. God, we don't want a building, we don't want land, we don't want a church service. We want more of you. We want your presence in the life of 8025. We want this church to be a church who knows you, who has surrendered their life to you, who lead others to do the same. God, that is what we desperately want. And God, don't give us anything that would take away from that. This is not about us, this is about you. God, help us to stay humble and help us to keep our eyes on you. God, I pray for all of us as individuals and corporately as a church that you would lay on our hearts clearly how you want us to sacrifice for your kingdom to be advanced. And God, in a time of economic uncertainty, the world would say, pick a better time to do something like this. God, and I just believe you're saying, take your step of faith and watch me. So God, I pray that you will. I pray that like Nehemiah, we approach this in fear and trembling and uncertainty, God, but knowing that you have called us to move. And so we are surrendering all to you for the advancement of your kingdom, God, and we are excited to see what you're going to do. We love you. We thank you.